everyone, Happy New Year. Thank you so much for staying with us throughout 2018. 40 years on, this very day, China established an official diplomatic relationship with the United States of America, the most critical and consequential one in China's recent history. It happened almost at the same time as the start of China's reform and opening up. How did China and the U.S. get this job done in an era of deep mistrust and confrontation at the height of the Cold War? And if overcoming ideological opposition was the task for these two nations 40 years ago, then what are the major challenges today for Sino-U.S. relationship? To review this past 4 decades and look to the future, I'm glad to be joined in the Beijing studio by Professor Da Wei, Assistant President of the University of International Relations, and Anna Tangen, author and columnist. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen. Well, this is the 40th anniversary. No one questions the importance. However, few in China would believe Americans across the Pacific Ocean would take this day very seriously, or they would look at the issue in their own way. So what do you make of different respective ways by the two countries to commemorate the 40th anniversary?
I think, for China, this bilateral relations is the most important relationship, and the United States is a country which could have greatest impact, no matter its positive or negative impact on China's future. So of course, China, from this from our perspective, China really, many people commemorate the bilateral relations and also discussing the current friction and conflicts between the two countries. Well, at the same time, I think for the United States, it's a little bit different bilateral relations for the U.S. Of course, it's also the most important bilateral relations for American. But I think for the U.S., they have a lot of things. I mean, for the U.S. audience, probably the domestic issue are the most important issues for them. So I don't think this 40th anniversary is as important as here in China for the American audience.
Anna, do you believe most Americans, particularly elites and policymakers in the D.C., have been left quite disillusioned about what China is today? Because they have obviously hoped to engage China in the hope of transforming this country into a liberal democracy, but obviously they were let down, and therefore most of them wouldn't take the 40th anniversary as seriously as China has done.
Well, for many, for the very conservative crowd, the 40th anniversary does mark the end, the period of defeat, in essence, for this idea that by the U.S., by China opening up, that the communist regime would fall. And that is as simple as it gets, and there are plenty of scholars who have said that. This is not some big hidden agenda. This was the foremost agenda that was on everyone's thing.
Does it amount automatically to the recognition at the same time of the communist leadership in China, since they have acknowledged the defeat?
Well, that's another thing. You've gone on to stage 2 now, that somehow, because China was successful at this, that somehow China cheated, that somehow China did something that was not counted on, and that there needs to be consequences for being successful. And this is the irony. Really what you have here is, we can talk about this in terms of the China relations, but within each country, you're seeing profound changes. The last 40 years within China has seen this huge burgeoning middle class, which has transformed China economically, all right? But in the U.S., it's been the opposite. The middle class has gone down, and the structures of these two different countries, these two different powers, are now rubbing up against each other because of economic concerns. So when people in the U.S. think about this 40 years, they're looking not at the geopolitical. They don't even remember the three-cornered issues that were going on between Russia, China, and the U.S. They think about it purely in economic terms.
But it seems why 7 years had passed before the Carter administration had decided to normalize the relationship, since Richard Nixon came over in 1972?
I think basically there are two reasons. At the international level, I think after Nixon visited China several years later, the U.S. and the Soviet Union start so-called detente period of their bilateral relations. So basically, the Soviet Union and the U.S. Relationship had increased or improved to some extent. So some people in the U.S. argued that probably the U.S. should not be so hastily to normalize the bilateral relations with China.
But I thought that the period of detente actually started from the end of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. The Americans were aware of the real danger that the Soviets imposed by deploying missiles in their neighborhood in Cuba. So as a result, part of the end game was the withdrawal of missiles from Greece and Turkey.
Yeah, and there is another reason. That is Taiwan. I think the U.S. and China cannot reach a consensus on how to deal with Taiwan. I mean the U.S. relationship with Taiwan. China, of course, asked the U.S. to cut the so-called diplomatic relations with Taiwan, withdraw troops from Taiwan, and also abandon their treaty with Taiwan. Well, this, I think, in the U.S., people cannot reach a consensus. So some people worry that U.S. may abandon the old friend. That refers to Taiwan. So I think there's no consensus domestically in the United States. So that prevent the several administration in the U.S. From establish the bilateral the diplomatic relations sooner.
Those who follow the development of this bilateral relationship between Washington and Beijing are clearly aware of the three landmark documents, particularly those in China. First of all, the Shanghai Communique, and then the Communique for establishing diplomatic relationship, and then August the 17th, the document that says a lot about arms sales to Taiwan. And the third and the fourth landmark that China refuses to recognize is the Taiwan Relations Act, which was passed by the U.S. Congress in the wake of the normalization of the relationship. Anna, how important is Taiwan for the U.S. government 40 years on?
It's not important except as a symbol. I mean, this is the assumption was that mainland China would somehow fall under some sort of system akin to what they have in Taiwan, and that was what we were just talking about. That somehow liberal democratic capitalism would break out here simply because China embraced capitalism as part of a toolbox of running its country. So in terms of how do people think of Taiwan, very few people really know much about Taiwan. It's shrouded in kind
of what about
things.
passing the Taiwan Travel Act?
I mean, this is political posturing. This is Trump and people, especially on the China hawks, trying to provoke China, trying to say that there's some wedge, because there is this feeling that China avoided or evaded its natural destiny, which is the the end of history. Francis Fukuyama's idea that there can be only one possible future, liberal democratic capitalism. And they're trying to manufacture a wedge, and that has become Taiwan. That's why you see these warships, running up the Taiwan Straits, American warships doing that. This is a provocation. This is why you see the South China Seas issue gaining such prominence in this. So it's going to continue to be there, but it's not the American people. What this is a subset of people, some closely linked to the military-industrial complex, who are very intent on keeping this issue alive.
The guy who stood behind the President Jimmy Carter in shaping the roadmap of normalizing relationship with the PRC back in 1979 was Dr. Brzezinski, National Security Advisor to the Carter administration. What do you think of the role that he had played? Of course, he played, I will say, the most, or maybe the second most significant role on the U.S. side. In Carter administration, there are different views regarding to the diplomatic relation with China. Particularly the Department of State have different view. At that time, the Secretary of State was Secretary Vance. I think for him, the priority of the U.S. foreign policy at that time was to reach a
a treaty with Soviet Union on arms control, and also the Panama Canal Treaty, I think, was also his priority. So for him, particularly because he has a Soviet Union agenda, so he does not want to offend the Soviets by, setting up the diplomatic relation with China. So he was not that enthusiastic at that time. But the White House was very enthusiastic. So President Carter and his senior aide, particularly Brzezinski, he played a key role. So the White House controlled the whole process, and that safeguarded the success of establishing our diplomatic relation on the U.S. side.
And I want to add on that is that this idea that what the relationships between Russia, the U.S., and China have been this kind of three-way balancing act. It's not unlike the romance of the Three Kingdoms, where there's a shifting alliances that are going on, and it depends on who's involved in what they see. So you had people, Brzezinski was a Russia hawk. He really saw them as the bad guys. He therefore went towards China. So it's a kind of like a card game where you have different people not necessarily running towards somebody, but perhaps trying to block somebody else. And I still think that even today, with Russia and China growing closer due to what's happening in the U.S., you still see vestiges of that.
But the nightmare of Secretary Vance may have been fueled or made even worse by the decision of late senior leader Deng Xiaoping to punish Vietnam back in the same year, 1979. I'm talking about the border clash, and the Carter administration was actually quietly supportive of this idea, without, of course, the silent authorization was not the correct word, but without the support of the Carter administration, this border clash launched unilaterally by late senior leader Deng Xiaoping would have been impossible. So why do you think Dr. Brzezinski and his president went so far as to allow Mr. Deng Xiaoping to have this border clash?
I think that's related to the viewpoints we discussed. How did they view the Soviet Union? I think the Carter administration and Mr. Brzezinski, they view the Soviet Union, Russia, as the most serious threat to the United States, while China was not. So there is a need for both for China and for the United States to try to kind of balance Soviet Union, and some people in the United States believe that the Soviet Union was trying to, for instance, trying to expand their influence, and actually that was correct after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. But that was in December 1979. Actually, almost 1 year after we established the diplomatic relation. But how do you view the Soviet Union? I think Mr. Deng Xiaoping was very clear that Soviet Union was aggressive and they want to expand their influence. Well, I think in Washington, in D.C., I think there were different views. Some people are hawks, some people maybe are doves. But I think the White House agree with Mr. Deng Xiaoping, and they think the Russians and also Vietnam at that time were the most serious threat to China.
Well, not only China, but I mean, remember, we had lost a war in Vietnam, and so there's national pride on the level. We also saw this kind of expansionist Russia going into areas where we really did not want them to be in the Pacific. Right? They have their territories in the north side. We didn't want them on the south side. They were getting. Remember where Vietnam is, and where the Philippines and all the rest of our bases and things like that are. This would have brought us into much closer proximity in terms of a possible direct confrontation. So strategically, I think there is no question that Brzezinski and Carter were happy to see China, let us say, shouldering the burden in terms of closing down Russian, what they saw as expansionism.
Ironically, Beijing assisted Hanoi in pushing back the American occupation and invasion of Vietnam during the war. Let me go to Mr. Jimmy Carter, former President of the United States. I interviewed him at least 2 times. during his stay in China to witness the village elections, because the Carter Center has been so concerned about democratization in developing countries. But I did talk about the U.S.-China relationship. Let's look at what he says. Mr. President, on January the 1st, 1979, diplomatic relations were established. How difficult was this decision for you, the then U.S. President?
Well, it was very difficult politically speaking, because there was an overwhelming sentiment in our country to recognize Taiwan as the sovereign nation, Chinese nation. And although President Nixon came here and issued the Shanghai communique with Chinese leaders and said there's only one China, he didn't say which China. And for 6 more years, the China that was recognized by the United States of America, the most powerful nation on earth, was Taiwan. And I decided when I became president that I would change that, because I felt that we should have diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China instead of Taiwan. And this was finally concluded with my secret negotiations with Deng Xiaoping during the year of 1978. And I invited Deng Xiaoping to visit my country. He accepted immediately. We have had that very wonderful contribution, not only to the well-being of Americans and Chinese people, but also to stability in Asia, and I think it's helped the situation on a global basis.
Why do you think Mr. Bush, your president, describes the bilateral relationship between Washington and Beijing as the most important and at the same time the most complicated bilateral relationship in the 21st century?
I don't have any doubt that it's probably the most important bilateral relationship in the world. And none of us envisioned the profound changes that were going to take place in your country.
Why did President Bush say it's also very complicated?
Well, we have a different system of government, which we recognize. But we have so far been able, with every succeeding president, basically to comply with the promises that I personally made when I was in the White House. None of them have violated my pledge of support for China in a peaceful way and my recognition of the situation with Taiwan, that is part of China. And so I think that even though there are complexities that have been brought about, I would say primarily by the remarkable expansion of Chinese influence, both economically and politically around the world, the future, in my opinion, is one of peace and cooperation, accommodating inevitable changes.
By the way, President Jimmy Carter's birthday happens to be October the 1st, our National Day. That's a pretty dramatic coincidence, isn't it? Now, having said this, we shouldn't ignore what Ronald Reagan did. At the height of the Cold War, the Reagan administration seemed to have taken China as a semi-ally in pushing back the Soviet influence. I'd like to have your thoughts on the influence of Ronald Reagan. And he is said to be the president, the only one who had sold arms to the PRC.
Yeah. As you said, I think in 1980s, during the Reagan administration, the U.S. and China had become kind of semi-ally. And the two countries, on one hand, they cooperate on the strategic issues, particularly balancing the Soviet Union, including selling the weapons to China, including...
Like Hawks, for example.
Yeah. And also like setting up radar station in Xinjiang, China, this kind of cooperation. On the other hand, I think Reagan started economic cooperation with China and helped the U.S. business enter the China market. So that laid the foundation for future China-U.S. relations, because actually after the end of the Cold War, I think the bilateral relations between our two countries, can only rely the second leg, that is the economic one. The counter-Soviet Union factor disappeared after that. So I think in the 1980s, our bilateral relations has gone beyond the 1970s. In 1970s, we only cooperate on security sense. But in 1980s, we cooperate on the two things together, simultaneously, economically and strategically. So that start during the Reagan administration. So I will say that's the honeymoon of the China-U.S. bilateral relations.
Now, what do you think of Bill Clinton? It is during the Clinton administration that this president separated the issue of human rights from the MFN, most favored trading nation status. That, of course, had caused controversies back in the States, in the D.C.
Well, I mean, Bill was an interesting guy. I mean, this was a very ideological piece for somebody who was very pragmatic. He was famous in Republican circles for picking off Republicans by promising them basically what we call pork in order to get them to vote for his particular things. It's not clear. I think he really thought that ideologically, the city on a hill, this type of idea that the U.S. was the center and would be the only viable system, would be the only viable system for the world. So he took the human rights angle very, very seriously, and that was, of course, carried on by his wife Hillary in terms of her campaigning. But this was not a very effective way of dealing with China, because when you start criticizing China, China ceases to be your friend. If you cheat, there's an old saying, you treat China as a friend, it will be your friend. You treat China as an enemy, and it will be your enemy.
It's what we call the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes, and it's true of all nations. So, I mean, Bill, I think he meant well. He did a lot on the domestics. I don't know that he was very skilled in terms of international. He didn't really have that much. Doing a year at Oxford does not qualify you to necessarily understand world politics. And for him, like many presidents, he saw the China relationship mostly in the eye of the domestic situation.
Do you think it is during the Clinton administration that the bilateral economic relationship had taken off?
Yes, of course. I think after 1989, I think the U.S. and the American elites debated about the future of China and the U.S. relations, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Actually, China seemed, lack of strategic importance, after the collapse of Soviet Union. So some people say we don't need to develop the bilateral relations with China as in 1980s. But I think after 3 or 4 year debate, I think the business community in the U.S. played a key role, try to persuade the Congress and also the executive branch that engaging China will help China and also will help the U.S. The U.S. will benefit from this economic engagement, and also probably, maybe perhaps, China will be shaped by this engagement politically, as we...
No, I don't think perhaps. I think it was an absolute certainty that China would change, that a communist government could never last through a period of economic change.
So actually, that was a period that the liberal illusion has, started. I think from Clinton administration. I think basically, Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, both of them are so-called liberal internationalists. They believe that through engaging other illiberal countries, they will gradually be shaped.
And this effort by the Clinton administration to separate human rights from the MFN certainly lays groundwork for China's eventual entry into the WTO in the year 2001. Do you think the Trump administration regrets deeply and has been left deeply disillusioned about this idea that China fails to become a liberal democracy despite the economic engagement?
No, I think it would be a mistake to see this as ideological with Donald Trump. Donald Trump sees the world very simply. He's on the playground. He's the biggest kid on the playground, and he's going to beat up the second biggest kid on the playground, and everyone else is going to bow to him. His is about the art of the deal, how he can get the most out of everybody around him. This is how a developer thinks. You maximize values. You grab everything that's on the table. I don't think there are people around him who are deeply ideological, who really are against China and see and blame China as being the #1 problem in the world. And you have to look no further than Bolton and Lighthizer and Navarro and Miller. They are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse when it comes down to identifying China as the problem. But this kind of idea that you can villainize China and that somehow this is going to solve the issues, I think is misplaced.
Previously, 4 Ts may have helped shape the relationship between Washington, Beijing, Tiananmen, Tibet, Taiwan, and technology. Right. But what about the future? Do you foresee 3 Ds, for example, delinking, disengagement, and discrediting, as other critical letters in summing up and characterizing the new relationship?
I think you did a very job by these 3 Ds. I think what we are seeing is so-called delink, disengagement, and decoupling, right?
Yeah, and discrediting or demonizing China.
Yeah, I think
5 Ds.
Yeah, but I think here the key is the U.S. and China, our 2 countries have different political and economic model. And for Trump administration, I think probably the economic model are more important. For them, they think that China has been so successful in the system, and the U.S. dragged China in this system. China was very successful in this system, but China's model was different. China used a different approach to get the country, risen in past 40 years. The U.S. think this is unfair. I mean, the Trump administration they believe this is unfair. China utilize its status as developing country and use some unfair instrument, unfair tools to.
They're complaining because China played the game better than they expected.
Do you think the 2 countries will go back to a Cold War?
I don't think, of course, I don't think the 2 countries can go back to the Cold War. It's totally different because China, no matter what kind of difficulty we have such a big amount of trade and also people-to-people exchanges, and we do have different political and economic model, but we do not have 2 ideologies which wants to replace or to defeat the other. But particularly for China side, we don't have that kind of ideology to say want to export and want to replace the U.S.
Very quickly, Anna, your prediction about the flashpoint, which is more devastating and dangerous, Taiwan or the South China Sea, between the 2 militaries? Taiwan. Well, we keep this end of the program open for our further discussion in the future, because next year is the 40th anniversary. Hope you enjoy the New Year's Day with our blessing. Until then, goodbye.